Today, official history offers us a simple picture of the past. Everything is more or less clear. Major catastrophes are known. Nothing overly unusual. But as soon as you begin to look at the details, this picture falls apart. We are told that over the last 500 years, there were only two truly global cataclysms: a volcanic eruption in South America in the early 17th century, and a giant eruption in Indonesia in the early 19th century. The first event is linked to the years without summer under Boris Godunov. The second, to the year without summer right after the eruption of Tambora. Temperatures fell, crops failed, people starved. Even school textbooks acknowledge this. But this is where the interesting part begins. Both of these volcanoes are located in the southern hemisphere. The official version insists that they were the cause of the strange climatic phenomena in Europe and Russia. Yet many facts do not fit this scheme. A question arises. Were these eruptions the root cause of the troubles, or merely a faint echo of something much more powerful and large-scale, something we are not told about? If the catastrophe was local, why were its consequences felt so long and so far away? The first troubling hints appear not in scientific reports, but in classical literature. In a novel from the early 19th century, the author casually describes a strange year. For a long time, an unprecedented star is visible in the sky. Cities, villages, and forests are burning simultaneously. In some places, the ground itself is scorched bare. This is not a dry chronicle. It is a work of fiction, but it is based on the living impressions of contemporaries. We are given no detailed explanations of these phenomena. Nowhere is it stated explicitly that this was a separate, planet-scale catastrophe. Yet the combination of signs makes one think. It is with such small details that the dismantling of the entire construction of official history begins. If a strange object appears in the sky, if fires rage simultaneously across enormous territories, if the earth burns so deeply that even decades later no forest or normal vegetation grows there, can this really be chalked up to ordinary natural processes? All the more so when, several decades later, we see something even stranger on those same lands. A complete absence of mature forests and desperate attempts by people to heat their homes with anything at all. Formally, we are told that Russia has always been covered in forests, that the country stood in woods, and that trees were cut for centuries. But the deeper one looks into 19th century sources, the more clearly a different picture emerges. The forests seem to have disappeared in a very short time, and this disappearance does not fit any familiar stories about logging and fires. In this first part, the starting point is crucial. We are facing not one strange fact, but a chain of inconsistencies. Volcanic eruptions on the other side of the world, unexplained celestial phenomena, scorched lands, vanished forests. All of this forms the very mystery from which it becomes impossible to look away. If you gather all the oddities that are carefully scattered across different corners of the planet, you get a picture that gives you chills. It all begins innocently enough with Australia. On old maps, the continent is marked as New Holland. The Dutch landed there, conducted affairs, explored the coasts. One would logically expect traces of this settlement, a smooth history of colonization. Instead, we see a void. The Dutch seem to have vanished. Their presence ends so abruptly that in the 19th century, Australia has to be rediscovered and resettled by the British Crown. A huge continent that, in theory, should have had continuous colonization, suddenly appears as a clean slate. The same pattern continues in Africa. On old maps, the continent looks like a green, water-rich world. Rivers, lakes, cities. By all logic, such a network of waterways and settlements should have only strengthened over time. But instead, rivers begin to disappear from maps. Lakes dry up. Cities quietly vanish from documents. The official version limits itself to vague phrases, but does not explain how entire regions could so quickly lose both water and population. It appears that at some point, Africa experienced not just local climate changes, but something far more massive, something they prefer not to discuss. Meanwhile, in the United States, another anomaly unfolds, seemingly unrelated. In the 19th century, freak shows, exhibitions of people with severe physical abnormalities, flourish across the country. There are so many such individuals that the shows become an entire industry. And then, by the 20th century, the phenomenon simply evaporates. We are told that medicine advanced, living conditions improved, and abnormalities became less common. But if you look at the time frame and the scale, everything appears too sudden. Where did crowds of people with severe deformities come from in such a short period? Why such a surge, followed by an equally sharp decline? Each of these stories could be dismissed as a simple historical curiosity. The Dutch disappearing from a continent. Africa once flourishing on maps, then drying up. The United States experiencing a wave of severe abnormalities in a single century. But all these events fall into the same time corridor. All of them, the beginning and middle of the 19th century. Exactly the period when official history explains all anomalies with just a couple of volcanic eruptions in the southern hemisphere. When coincidences repeat too often, they cease to be random. One gets the feeling that somewhere between the lines, a common factor is hidden, an event that struck different parts of the world simultaneously. The result? Dried rivers, vanished cities, strange surges and birth defects, scorched lands, and future problems with forests. But you won't find a chapter titled "The Global Catastrophe of the 19th Century" in textbooks. Instead, quiet lacuna, empty spaces, and carefully arranged inconsistencies that no one rushes to explain. Now it is time to return to the place where, in theory, there should not have been any problems with forests at all. To Rus. Since childhood, we are told, Russia is a land of forests, slash-and-burn agriculture, fairy tale thickets, endless oak groves. An image is created as if trees were always here, so many that peasants could calmly cut and burn forest for fields for centuries. But if instead of a school textbook, you take real 19th century texts, the picture collapses. There is one important scientific fact that is usually quietly avoided. A famous 19th century soil scientist proved Chernozem, the richest and most fertile soil, does not form under forests. It requires steppe or meadow grasses. Forest grows on clay, sand, loam. You can find Chernozem under forest only in one case: if the area used to be open steppe or meadow, and only later did forest grow there. Soil logic itself says, first open space, then trees, not the other way around. Slash and burn agriculture, which is often used to justify deforestation, is also not as beneficial as described. Yes, ash gives a burst of fertility, but only for a couple of seasons. Then nutrients wash out, leaving behind the same poor sand or clay. If the forest had really stood here for centuries and been burned piece by piece, peasants simply could not have fed their families after a few generations. Yet we know that vast areas of Chernozem lie exactly where we are shown supposedly ancient forests. And this is where the chilling testimonies begin. In the late 19th century, Leo Tolstoy describes famine. Peasants agree to horrible terms for the right to collect from a field the uprooted potato tops. Not even potatoes, dry stems. In another text, he writes directly, "During famine, landlords sold potato tops as fuel to freezing peasants at a price of 5 rubles per desyatina. Potato tops as firewood." This is not poetry, but a direct economic detail. Anyone who has ever heated a stove understands how absurd this is. Dry tops ignite and burn instantly, giving almost no heat. They can be used only in one case, when there is absolutely no wood fuel. Not just little, none. No forest, no shrubs, no old orchard trees, not even crooked willows by ravines. Tolstoy, who knew peasant life well, records a situation in which whole villages are forced to warm themselves with what would normally be thrown away. The author of the scenario reinforces this picture with personal experience. Even in a treeless village, there is always something to burn. Old birches, apple branches, poplars, willows. In the worst case, rotten riverbank trees. But in the villages described by the classic, there is nothing. Emptiness. This is no longer local poverty, but the trace of a massive disappearance of woody vegetation across huge areas. Against this backdrop, the official Russia, a land of forests, sounds not like a fact, but like a carefully maintained myth meant to obscure an unpleasant question. Where did everything go so fast and so completely? Potato tops are not the end of it. In the same 19th century texts appear details that further destroy the image of eternal forests. A city garden is described. One would expect large, sprawling trees where families stroll and old people sit on benches. Instead, we read, "The garden consists of thin young trees, poorly rooted, with supports underneath. These saplings are no higher than reeds. This is not an old park. This is fresh planting, young growth trying to establish itself where nothing existed before." How? Where did the old trees go if Russia had lived in forests for centuries? Next, the road between settlements. On both sides, hummocks, sparse young pines, scattered spruce saplings, and charred trunks of old trees. This is not just little forest, but a clear picture. The old forest burned, and in its place only newly sprouting trees are appearing. No centuries-old pines and spruces, only remnants and undergrowth. This resembles not slow logging, but one or several powerful events that wiped out mature forest cover across vast areas at once. Another description, a village on a hillside. More than 200 log huts, and not a single living tree among them. Not a bush, not an apple tree, not a small garden. Only bare logs, a gray slope, and emptiness. Try imagining such a village today. Is it possible to see a settlement where the amount of vegetation is exactly 0? Even in harsh places, people still plant at least a few trees or bushes. But here, nothing. As if all living cover were cut to the ground, and then people were simply told to live on the scorched surface. To this bleak picture is added another key detail: the sharp drop in crop yield in the second half of the 19th century. In agricultural documents, one finds the old term, nine-fold return. From 1 pood of seed, they harvested 9. After the approximate boundary of the 1860s, this indicator falls to threefold, 3 times less. Farming suddenly becomes barely profitable, peasants on the brink of survival. Such a widespread collapse cannot be dismissed as random, bad harvest years. At such a scale, it can be explained only by one thing: a serious climate change toward cooling. It got colder, therefore people needed to heat homes more. But there was nothing to burn. No forests, not even small woody vegetation. All lines converge at this point. Traces of fires, charred trunks, young plantings instead of old gardens, villages without a single tree, potato tops sold as fuel, and at the same time, falling soil fertility and cold years. The mosaic forms a disturbing picture. Somewhere between the early and late 19th century, something happened that destroyed forests, worsened the climate, and forced people to live on bare land, preparing the ground not for a fairy tale land of forests, but for a future myth about it. To understand the possible scale of the disaster, the author offers a simple visual key: the site of the Tunguska meteorite impact. Modern photographs show that the area is covered with relatively young trees. There are no thick, centuries-old trunks. The forest seems to have restarted just decades ago. The old cover fell, rotted, and a new one rose, still young, still thin. This is a local picture understood by everyone: a strong impact, a field of fallen trees. Years later, young growth. Now expand this picture to the scale of a country, or even an entire continent. What 19th century sources describe looks very much like such a situation, only stretched across time and territory. Young, weak plantings in cities, a road among charred trunks and sparse young pines, villages without a single tree, starving peasants heating stoves with potato tops, plus disappeared colonies in Australia, dried rivers and vanished cities in Africa, strange waves of physical anomalies in America. All of this fits into one century and one logic. Somewhere, an impact occurred so strong that its consequences spread across the hemisphere or even the entire planet. Official history prefers to explain climate changes with a single eruption, Tambora, in 1815. But it stays silent about the cooling around the 1860s, the massive shortage of fuel, and the fact that in vast territories there was literally nothing to heat stoves with. It barely comments on the strange emptiness in descriptions of nature. Why do texts of that time so often mention young saplings, thin trunks, poorly rooted plantings, and not mighty old forests? A conspiratorial view of these coincidences offers no ready answer of what exactly happened, but it points to something important. We are dealing not with a random set of unrelated anomalies, but with traces of a single, carefully obscured storyline. A catastrophe that could have wiped out forests, altered the climate, reshaped ecosystems and settlements, pushed out of textbooks into scattered notes, literary passages, and strange economic details like selling potato tops for fuel. And if we want to understand what really happened to forests, climate, and people in the 19th century, we will have to rely not on smooth official schemes, but on these living fragments of the past, and not be afraid to ask questions, where everyone has learned to stay silent.